John B. Watson was one of the most important psychologists in our modern day. He was the first to popularize the scientific theory of behaviorism and establish it as a psychological school. In the 1890s, Ivan Pavlov was the first to experiment with classical conditioning. He conducted an experiment by getting dogs and sounding a tuning fork every time before feeding them. This later influenced John B. Watson to conduct a similar study but with a little human. This was the Little Albert experiment. In Watson's experiment, little Albert was used during the experiment to be conditioned. He was born to a woman who was a nurse in the Harriet Lane Home of Invalid Children. Although Albert was being raised in a hospital environment, he was developing perfectly fine and stable. Was it possible for Watson to condition a human? First of all, Watson presented little Albert with a neutral stimulus. This is a stimulus that before conditioning does not naturally bring about the response of interest. These were objects that little Albert was not afraid of and initially liked. This included fire, a monkey, a dog, a rabbit, and a little white mouse. Albert took the most interest in the mouse, so Watson continued most of the study with the mouse. Watson introduces an unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response without any learning. A loud bar was struck in front of Albert, and this would cause him to become distressed. The loud, frightening noise triggered a response from Albert. This was the unconditioned response. This is where the conditioning begins. A little white mouse is presented to Albert, but every time he reaches for the mouse to play, the bar is struck. This is called the conditioning process. This was done repeatedly, pairing the sight of the mouse and the loud noise. As a result, Albert starts to associate the mouse with the fear he experienced due to the loud noise. After many trials of Albert playing with the mouse and the loud bar being struck, the neutral stimulus, which is the mouse, becomes conditioned stimulus. Now the mouse brings fear to little Albert even without the loud noise. A conditioned stimulus brings forth a conditioned response from Albert. Now Albert is afraid of the mouse, and without the loud noise, he is still distressed and upset when seeing the mouse. Watson had realized that he had indeed conditioned a fear response in a human. Little Albert was then presented with a rabbit, but he immediately started crying and ran as far away from it. Then a dog was brought in, and Albert wasn't scared until the dog came right up to his face. A fur coat was brought in, and Albert turns away and becomes agitated. Then a white fuzzy mask was used, which invoked a more negative response from Albert. Little Albert is experiencing the phenomenon called generalization. Any object that looks similar or has the same characteristics as the little white mouse will invoke the same response, which is fear. Now Watson wanted to see if the fear that was learned would remain over a period of time. Watson sent little Albert home and returned 1 month later. Then when Albert came back, they tested him with the same objects paired with the loud noises, and indeed, little Albert was terrified. Watson once again proved that he could condition fear into little Albert. Watson concluded that phobias were most likely conditioned responses. The Little Albert experiment is extremely important in psychology. This study has inspired many modern psychologists and continues to influence today's psychological investigations.